My name is Dr. Lanisa Kitchener. I am Director of Education and Scholarly Initiatives here at the National Museum of African Art. And it is my great, great pleasure to welcome all of you to what I think will be a wonderful, wonderful program this evening. We will start with a film screening. It's actually not just a screening, but it is a premiere screening of Ota Benga. And it's actually, I have to tell you, well, you'll have to see it for yourself. I actually don't have to tell you. You'll see for yourself. But what I can tell you is that I first saw it not too long ago. It was at a conference that I attended, and it was only a snippet of the film. It was at the Black Portraitures Conference in, I think it was in Florence. I was going to say Venice, but that's where the Biennale is. But it was in Florence, and I immediately went up to one of the co-producers, and I said, please, 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 can we share this film with our audience at the museum? And there's a reason why. The reason is because so often when we are in a museum like the National Museum of African Art, it is easy to look at an object and not put it into context. And for me, what the film did most immediately was help to add context to the work that I do and to the visitorship that I'm responsible for when they come into the museum. As some of you may know who are familiar with the Smithsonian, you'll know that there is also a collection over at the Natural History Museum, right? There's an exhibit there called African Voices. And not too long ago, just this past summer, we held a docent class, and in that class, when I say a docent class, we were training a new cohort of docents to lead tours in our galleries. And in that class, one of the efforts was really to try to get our class to figure out, I'm struggling for the language here, but to figure out innovative ways to speak to really the immense measure of confusion that comes into our museum when visitors are viewing many of the objects that we have on display. And so when you look at the film, you'll have a better sense of what our collections here are about, I think, to some extent. But also, by extension, you'll have a greater sense of the distinctions between our collection here and the collection that is at the National Museum of Natural History. I won't go too much farther into commentary other than to say that after the film, we will have what I know will be an exciting conversation. We will have Tabidi Lewis, Professors Tabidi Lewis, Pamela Newkirk, Michael Eric Dyson, Malefi Asante, and Professor Nii Coker, who is a co-producer of the film. That session will be moderated by someone that is very, very dear to me, a person who guided my own dissertation research while I was studying at Howard University, and that is the chair of the Department of English at Howard University, Dana Williams. So I'm confident that we will have a very fantastic conversation following the film. And just before we get started, I know that Jean Baudin and Nii Coker would like to come just up for a moment, if you will, to set it off for us.
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Kitchener, for giving us this opportunity, and wonderful we met in Italy. And I want to thank everybody, family members especially, who made it here, sister-in-law, my brother, my mentors, Dr. Malefi Asante, the station supervisor, Dr. Sheila Clark-Ekong, the editor of the documentary who's here, Abenathi, sitting back there, my friend and colleague here who we've been doing films together for the last, 10, 12, 15 years?
15 years.
And so essentially, it's very good because this was a race thing and we kind of had to bounce off each other. Race is a tough thing to talk about, but we got through it.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I'd like to recognize also the dean of my school, Dr. Ron Shields, and my wife, Teresa. It was a wonderful trip to make this movie. Very fascinating because we came up with basically two questions. Why Ota Benga was put in a cage with chimpanzees and orangutan. This is a very shocking thing the first time we learned about that. And also the second question for the film was, are we still racist? Are we still the same? And I think, did we get the answer in the movie? Not really. This is for you to decide. But it's a very serious subject, and we took it at heart. And I hope we'll contribute a little bit to that terrible problem.
All right, folks, just at least one more person that I must acknowledge who was also instrumental in helping me to complete my dissertation. That person is Dr. Mbai Cham, Chair of African Studies at Howard University. I saw him. He's there. And so to lead us in a conversation about these histories, particularly in relation to African and African American masculinities, it's just a wonderful assortment of scholars who, my goodness, have written the books and have done the research and can help us as we are thinking through what these histories mean and how they impact our broader humanity. So if I may, begin to call some of those folks just up to the podium and then also turn it over to Dr. Dana Williams. Dr. Dana Williams, if you could just join me. Everybody, this is Dr. Dana Williams, Chair of English and Professor of English at Howard University. We also have with us Professor Pamela Newkirk, Professor of Journalism at NYU. We also have our good friend Thabiti Lewis. Professor Thabiti Lewis deals in English and I think also African American Studies, right? At Washington State University, Vancouver. We also have, in the very far back, our good friend Professor Michael Eric Dyson, who is Professor of Sociology at Georgetown University. And we have, of course, our very good friend, Professor Malefi Kete-Asante, Chair of African American Studies at Temple University and Professor. And we have to get just one more chair, of course, for Nii Coker, and I'll take leave from the podium to do that and turn it over to Dr. Dana to get started.
Good evening. How are you all? It's my pleasure to moderate this discussion, and I will do as Lanissa has asked me to do, which essentially is to make sure that there is sufficient time for your questions and then some answers for those. So what she asked each panelist to do was to give opening remarks for about 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll try to stay pretty close to that, and then we will have the floor open for question and answer. So having all digested as quickly as we possibly could the film, I'll ask Nii to start for us, please.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much.
And yes, please.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to talk for very long. I'm glad you all saw it, and I guess I'll just, kind of feel more comfortable taking questions later. I'm looking for Dr. Joel Glassman. I can't seem to find him. Oh, I just wanted to kind of acknowledge the executive producer. Thank you, Joel. 8 years of funding. He never cut us off one day. He'd think about it and scratch his head and go, oh my God, again, but he paid for everything. Thank you so much. I guess essentially I'll just kick off with Ota Benga. It took about 8 years, like we said, to get this done, and, a lot of challenges along the way, trying to define and understand really, how this could have happened. And, my own theory, and I know Pamela kind of, we talked about it during her interview, kind of disagreed on some things, but I'm not quite sure. I still have a problem with the suicide theory. I'm not still sure that he did it, and why the grave is unmarked. And so I just still have a lot of questions, and Jean, of course, knows. It almost went in different directions because I never mentioned this, but my editor, Jim Abernathy, is from Ferguson, Missouri. And so in the editing suite, we had a lot of discussions because, he's Caucasian, I'm African-American, and we talked a lot about making that the focus. And so I still see a tie and a connection there, and, I'd like to hear more from everybody later on. That's all I want to say. Take my own time, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Perhaps we will start with Pamela, who is the author of Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga. A wonderful read. It's a difficult read in the way of hearing the facts, particularly knowing exactly what happened and all of the implications, but an important read, I think. Difficult in the sense that not difficult to read in terms of its accessibility, but difficult to try to stomach and process in the same way that the film was. But incredible work there. Maybe you'll talk a little bit about some of the archival work that really disputes any attempts to sanitize the story.
So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here to celebrate Nee's very important work. And you know, we met as he was finishing his film, and he managed to slide me in. And so I thank you for that as well. So my book is based on all primary documents. Unlike Nee, who was able to interview people, some people who either knew Ota Benga, like Carrie McRae Allen, who actually, we had the same agent, which is how I ended up doing the book on Ota Benga, because she would often talk to my agent about Ota Benga, and my agent was like, you should write a book, but she was not really, willing to do the digging 4 or 5 years of archival research. So anyway, so my book is really a corrective, and one of the many corrections in my book is this contention that Ota Benga and Samuel Werner was friends, as the grandson in his book, published in 1992, contended. He wrote a book about the friendship between Samuel Werner and Ota Benga, which made my blood boil. He knows, I was just like shaking. I was just so furious about that. You know, but that is just one of the many allegations. In the 1970s, the New York Zoological Gardens, better known as the Bronx Zoo, and its own historical account of Ota Benga says it's unlikely he was ever exhibited at all. And that, he walked in a cage, he was helping out with the monkeys. Oh yeah, we had a sign because people were curious about him. And of course, the New York Bronx Zoo at the time in its own bulletin had recorded this exhibit. And there were like voluminous archival documents, documenting his exhibition at the zoo. And even the New York Times in 1916, and whether you believed he killed himself, which the coroner's report and all of the archival evidence suggests, but whether or not he did, he died in 1916. And when he did, the New York Times, which during the exhibit for about a month had written 24 articles on the exhibit, but 10 years later said that it was urban legend, that he had never been exhibited, that he actually had worked at the zoo. So all of the people who played a part in Ota Benga's exploitation during his life for 100 years had the final say on what actually occurred. And so, it was my privilege to be able to go back to the archives to try to give Ota Benga a voice. And now I have my brother over here, Nee, who's also magnifying and bringing the volume up on Ota Benga's voice and his life. And so I'll leave it there for now.
Part of what we wanted to do with this conversation too was to look at the ways that African and African American masculinity has been represented in literature, film, and visual art, but then also in contemporary culture. So Tapiti will give us a little sense of what that looks like as well.
So I was going to start with a number of things. Thank you all for having me here today. My work, Ballers of the New School, Race, Sport, and American Culture, is an interesting connection to the spectacle that we just watched regarding Ota Benga. And in contemporary culture, what's really interesting is we see athletes in positions of heroism and positions where people want to emulate others. And what happens is there's a counter discourse that's constantly taking place in film, whether you're listening to the narratives that take place in Sports Center, the narratives that are taking place in the documentaries that are constantly saying to you, watch, but be afraid. Watch, but don't be like these particular individuals. And so as I was looking at this film, I was thinking about the exhibit outside. When you first come in, there's a gentleman laying on a table who's naked. And it made me think about Ron Artest laying on a table when water was tossed on him. And the response to him being treated as an object and spectacle, which was angry, which is the same as Ota Benga. You know, these manifestations continue in the contemporary culture. So I was thinking about some contemporary artists like Thomas Willis and Charlie Palmer, and just like the exhibits that we have here today that attempt to humanize. And so you say, well, why is that the case? We live in a world where I was listening to Werner and your comments, this sort of cognitive dissonance that permeates our culture. I don't want to accept the fact that, you know, this particular behavior is taking place, because that, or these realities of humanity actually deconstructs the inhumanity that has been constructed to justify the activities that take place. So I was thinking about someone like Tony Bennett and Mabel Wilson, whose works outline the history of museums and museum culture, and this constant push-pull that takes place with 18th and 19th century expositions to, as you saw in the film, depict this otherness. So when I was saying, you know, I'm looking at sports films, I'm thinking about films like Glory Road, I'm thinking about films like 42, The Express. There's always this this narrative that suggests there are these really great people who were there, who weren't, and the dynamics weren't as bad, you know, as what really existed. And so we have this sort of past tense understanding of a reality that was really very much quite different. And so, you know, the art images that are constantly permeating, we think, oh, you know, how does that exist? I always look at the ESPN body issues and what are the depictions. I was just looking at Vogue magazine. Two things come to mind, and I'll end and move forward. But I began my book looking at the depiction of who was this kid? LeBron James on the cover of Vogue with Giselle. And what's really interesting about that is because I've had close interaction with a number of the Nike people, because I'm in the Portland area and I know some of the executives. And so their whole thing was, how are we going to market this kid? And of course, the marketing was Michael Jordan, right? We want this this figure that can be digested, that can be very absorbed by a wide cultural swath. And so when I saw is it Leibowitz? Is that right? Is she the photographer?
Annie Leibowitz.
Yes. She constructs this King Kong, which is antithetical to everything that they've tried to do, and that he's done everything to try and be very appealing. And so that's one thing. And then the same photographer does the visual shoot of Serena Williams, where her legs are spread on the uneven bars, and the reason I mention that is because they fold into this particular magazine issue her good friend, another tennis player, a Caucasian young lady, and she's just simply running. And so just the constant spectacle, the over-sexualized presentation of these black bodies. But it makes me a little bothered. I was going to do all this talking about Du Bois and the criteria of Negro art, but one of the things that Du Bois said in that, which is we're really in this interesting sort of conundrum. So many negative and bad things have been constructed that we don't even want to touch what may not be positive and perfect. And so, so then his advice is, we just have to construct within our own worldview and just, I guess follow the language of Hughes, which is, we build our temples for tomorrow and the hell with everybody thinks. And so that would be mine.
And a good segue, I think.
Thank you.
So I've met all of the other folks on the panel. I have not had the pleasure, although I'm very familiar with his work, of personally meeting Molefi Asante, so I won't take the liberty of calling him Molefi.
That's
Asante.
It's all right. Thank you very much. First of all, let me just say thank you. I'm really delighted to be here, be in the presence of Dr. Driscoll, whom we go way back to the UCLA days. I'm really happy to see him here. Also would like to thank Nia Koka and Jean Baudon for an incredibly wonderful portrait, something that will be very inspiring for my students and will also, I think, help us with what we're confronted with. And I really want to just say, I'm really honored to be sitting right here between Sabiti and Michael. It's like, wow, I mean, I made the big times. and with Dr. Newkirk. So it's really beautiful. So, but let me just share you. In 1903, Du Bois published Souls of Black Folk, right? So now, 40 years or so earlier, we have 4 million African people out of bondage. 1865, we out of bondage. 1904, Theodore Roosevelt is president of the United States. America is sort of like feeling like, wow, we are in ascendance. So let's really do something. And let's have this exposition in St. Louis. And not only let's have this exposition, but let's celebrate the greatness of the American society. I mean, we have the Louisiana Purchase. Let's, you know, we're really moving, right? Of course, 45 years earlier, maybe 50 years earlier, there had been the exploitation of Black Tom, Blind Tom. I don't know if you ever heard of Blind Tom, but he's a very interesting figure. Blind Tom was a musical genius who knew 7,000 songs and compositions in his head and was exploited for 35 years by white people who basically took him around and put him on exhibition. Okay, you know, you sing a song, you sing a tune, and Blind Tom would memorize it. You could play you the whole thing. You know, you do anything, Blind Tom. The exploitation was so severe that there were people who came out and said, you can't treat a human being like this. And then, of course, now, in the early part of the 20th century, we get Ota Benga. But there are already black people here. We hadn't gone anywhere. We were here. So what is this deal about going to Africa to get another black person, to bring this black person here, to put this black person in a cage? There's a problem here. And the problem is this, that the people who put Ota Benga in the cage were the same people who also were having African people in this country lynched and were celebrating the lynchings. So when we got amazed at Ota Benga and the people, the crowds of 40,000 people went out to see Ota Benga. Thousands went out to see black people lynched. My home is Valdosta, Georgia. And in 1918, just about 14 or 15 years after Ota Benga, Mary Turner is lynched. Her fetus is cut out of her womb. She's dragged through the streets of my town. So when I look at this film, it says to me that there is something that is going on that is so complex and yet so simple. You know, that there are many pieces here. I mean, so we can talk about Darwinism, right? But the fundamental problem here is that the theory and the doctrine and the practice of white racial domination continues to be at the core of the American society. That's our problem. Now, to deal with this problem is not simply that we say, okay, this is voyeurism. We have to deal with this problem at the root. How do we educate white people? That is our problem. You know, and I won't be long, just want to say this. They interview black people on television when a black man is killed in Ferguson. You see the microphone, get black person, you go talk. I want them to interview some white folks. You know, I want them to say, okay, black people have been killed, you know, interview white people. Why do you think this is happening to black people? That's what I want to hear. I want to hear the news reporters go that way. And when you see the film, this film, and I just want to say, brilliantly edited and well done, and I like that part in there where Asante goes. It's very nice. It's very nice. It's a very well done film. I want to say it's nice. It's very beautiful, right? But here's what I want to say is that one of the things that we have to hear the voices of our white colleagues and friends and brothers and sisters. They've got to tell us what is it that produces this behavior, because I can't. You ask me, you know, how do you feel about this black woman who was picked up in the classroom and thrown? Don't ask me. Ask the white people. I want to know how they feel, because once we do that, we begin to get at the problem of Ota Benga. And I just want to stop here and say that you know, there's a lot more to be said about Leopold and Henry Stanley, and that whole attitude that was in Europe as well as in America, because it was transatlantic. They both had the same attitude and the same idea, and this notion of the ranking of races that developed out of the German experience is something that we really need to also look at, because the hierarchy was not just worldwide. It was hierarchy also in Europe itself. And that hierarchy, by the way, I traveled to Europe a lot. That hierarchy is still in Europe.
Well, I don't want to, thank you. Well, I don't want to leave the question here, but even as you were talking, I am hopeful that Brother Dyson will give us a little bit of insight about the possibilities of that being related to backlash. So much of it is related to backlash. As you speak to enslavement having not been over for a very extended period of time, so much of having to go to the Congo quite probably has to do with you now have to have a new proxy. The thing that was there before, you're responding to achievement. In the same way that contemporarily there is a response to contemporary black achievement leads to backlash. Now, as I said, I don't want to lead the question, so do what you want to do. I just curious.
Well, I'm glad to be next to the godfather of all this. What we do. Molefi Asante is the godfather of what we do as we study black people, African people in the American context. We got to give it up for him. I mean, that's true. That's true. And then Professors Lewis and Newkirk just brilliantly exposing, and I can't wait to read Professor Newkirk's book there. And I've interviewed Professor Lewis on my radio show, just brilliant expositions of what we're confronting here today. And I want to thank Brother Coker for making this this great film, and Professor Williams for moderating this. You know, backlash is a significant word. It's a blacklash as well. You think about Susan Faludi's book, Backlash, in terms of feminist theory and the presence of women. Just when women get in control of some stuff, then all of a sudden it's wrong, right? If we can take it on the level of gender before we even get to race. I mean, I don't make no comments about, say, Hillary Clinton, but what's interesting about all of that is that, you know, just when she started leading the pack, all of a sudden people got problems with all kind of stuff that the fellas get a pass on all the time. That's right. So she got to act a certain way, talk a certain way, not laugh, cry. John Boehner can cry all day. That's right. and he's celebrated, right? He's celebrated. That's right. You know, if Hillary Clinton, is she human? Yeah. Well, what do you do to women who act human in this society? You demonize them and you marginalize them. So when you talk about what's going on here, Ota Benga, Obama, right? He's in a cage too. It's a gilded one. That's right. It's a gilded one. It's a zoo up in Congress, we could say. But this backlash, literally seen as an ape, a chimp, a simian. Obama has been unbeautifully, unceremoniously compared to a nothing, a cipher, right? Because of the presence of extraordinary achievement, the presence of black intelligence has, and if you don't like Obama, ain't a black brother been made you gonna really dig. Right? I mean, in the ultimate sense, right? He real nice with his. He's very polite. He don't be mad. He don't get angry. You know what I'm saying? Shit, what you want? What you want?
He's cool.
He's good. Look. Now he done gone black and can't come back. He done gone. I don't think this mic. He done gone black in a big way right now. Right? He can't. He done fell in blackness and can't stand up. He might paint the White House black. He is living in public housing after all. So for me, when I think about Ota Benga, I think about all these kids that we're crapping on now with the Black Lives Matter. That's all they saying. They treat me like a human being. You have demonized me. You have anthropologized. Look at the brilliant in précis genealogical Nietzschean kind of, if you will, and Chancellor Williams like analysis that Professor Asante offered. Think also about the fact that this is the emergence of scientific rationality in terms of sociology, in terms of anthropology, and in terms of psychology, right? All around the same time. Not the Naturwissenschaften, as they say, the natural sciences, the Geisteswissenschaften, the soft sciences. But look what they're doing, real soft, right? Anthropology, psychology, and sociology, and look what they're doing. The object de rigueur, the analysis they are making of the black body, right? We got the Venus Hottentot on the one hand with Sarah Bartman, and we've got the spectacle of the black male. That's why even with Black Lives Matter, we can't just talk about black men dying from the police. We got to talk about sisters too, right? Because it's both and. It's Sarah Bartman and Ota Benga, right? All of them together. Black men and black women being subject to a suspect scientific anthropological estimation, treating him like a cog in the machinery of American capital, and the way in which Europe rode upon the demonization and dehumanization of blackness. And it's a backlash because black people, despite all the crap and the stuff we got to deal with, still humane, still ain't dog nobody. I mean, America, every time there's an international terror event, ought to be thanking God for American Negroes. Because we ain't Al-Qaeda the game. We ain't ISIS the game. Right? We could have been poisoning water streams and blowing up schools and bombing. We ain't done none of that. We took your religion, yo being the Western grounded conception of what Christianity is, and then made it more Christian, made it authentically Christian, rescued it from the peril of ultimate hypocrisy and contradiction, and injected into it, as Dr. King said, into the veins of this country, a humanism. Now, I don't want to idolize and idealize black people. We know we human like anybody else, prone to the same error like anybody else, right? When we get to the issues of homosexuality, see for reference. So what's interesting, right? We use the same, where we become sexual rednecks at that point, right? It's Sunday. It's Sunday. You get me. I mean, it's Sunday. I'm a Baptist preacher, but I ain't been to no black church to turn down gay tithes. So what's interesting, it seems to me, is that this Ota Benga is the quest of black people perennially for recognition and self-respect. Acknowledge me as a human being. Don't turn me into a thing. If he killed himself, did Sandra Bland kill herself? What was she in the position for, even if she did? If Ota Benga killed himself, Martin Luther King Jr. said, look, somebody shot him, but what really killed him was white civilization, white supremacy in America. So what killed Ota Benga, he might have pulled the trigger, but he ain't killed himself. What killed him was the vicious grip of white supremacy in a Western civilization that ostensibly was predicated upon rationality. And it was so irrational, so that intelligence can never ultimately save you. It's not being smart, it's being good at the end of the day. So for me, when I look at Ota Benga in terms of the backlash, it's deep. It's deep because, like I began with Obama, the resistance to him. Look, I ain't saying if you got criticism of Obama, you're racist, but dadgum. Look at all the stuff he's had to deal with. If the man had a little help, what could he have done in this country? But the backlash was so deep. The fact that a black man was in charge of American empire, that a black face was being projected to the world, and he licked them twice at the poll, right? Remember, he was up there at the speech in the House of Representatives, and he was telling them that he ain't got to run no more. The Republicans got real smart with him. He had to come back on him in a black style. He said, that's because I whipped your ass twice. What you want? Right? And if I could be Obama's anger translator, I'll beat you twice, bitch. All right, so back to my point. So the point is that here's a man who represents, if you will, the convergence of high intelligence, profound credentials derived from the white society that now stood in judgment of him, and the resistance of an obstructionist Congress and the collective imagination that was scared to death of a black man in charge. And one of the reasons, one of the great fears of white people when Obama was first running for office was that he gonna do to us what we done to them, right? And that's a real fear. So for me, when I look at Ota Benga, I think about Black Lives Matter. Professor Lewis brought up Serena Williams. I mean, she's Ota Benga too, right? The woman making the most money in terms of endorsements is a white female because she looks the part. No disrespect to being blonde and blue, blonde haired and blue eyed. That's beautiful of a certain variety, a certain stripe. That ain't the only kind of beauty. So that Serena Williams, that's ebony ecstasy unfurled in coffee flesh. I mean, man, that's man. Latissimus dorsi, gluteus maximus, pectoralis major. Look at the physiological dehumanization of a black woman because she doesn't measure up to dark skin, right? Black people ourselves have to contend with the vicious internalization of self-hatred that we have when we see beautiful black people that we can't even recognize in our own race. So Ota Benga represents the kind of the Africanization of our collective consciousness, and as Professor Asante said, it ain't like they got to go nowhere to get no African because we got plenty up in here. So the exoticized sense of the foreign blackness, that's why Obama was attractive in a certain way. Exotic Negro identity, foreign blackness will somehow be more acceptable than the indigenous blackness, which reminds us of the guilt we have as white Americans, right? So what's interesting to me is that there is a phenomenon of the backlash. I think about the black people and the way in which we've been treated as museum pieces. Here we are in this African museum, which is beautiful, but the way in which museums have become curators of the dehumanization of black people and the specimen and the empirical evidence of our humanity, even in the midst of their attempt to show how we lack culture, and humanity is the greatness of this black culture. So for me, Obama, Serena Williams, LeBron James, and not only on the cover where he's treated like King Kong, Fay Ray versus King Kong, when he left Cleveland for the first time. My God, they act like he was a runaway slave then, as somebody else said, right? Because white men leave all the time, chasing money, doing their thing. Black man ain't got the same prerogative, right? So when we look at the whole scope of it, yes, I think that Ota Benga stands as a colossal metaphor for the dehumanization of black people, and the Black Lives Matter movement now is the long redress and the insistence that black humanity be acknowledged as the beautiful, complicated, wonderfully, beautiful, and also wonderfully ugly and wonderfully humane expression that everybody else has the right to have access to. So, Ota Benga, I'm so glad y'all made this film, the book, and our humanity is constantly at stake, and we have to constantly reassert the necessity of identifying with that brother, because he is us. And at the end of the day, unless we resurrect the tropes, the metaphors, and the insistence on that humanity, we are, along with him, are buried in an unnamed grave. that doesn't have any identity other than the blackness that has been so widely demonized.
We will open the floor now for questions. If you would just stand, I'll bring the microphone to you.
Hi, thank you. It was a fabulous, fabulous film. Thank you so much. I had a question, just as a point of information. Samaria Rice, the mother of Tamir Rice, will be speaking at the UN on Tuesday, and she's bringing the plight of African Americans to the United Nations. So I ask all of you to please keep her in prayer on Tuesday because it's a major address for us. Dr. Newkirk, you mentioned the black church in the film. We talked about how the black church attempted to intervene and to lend a voice to the problem of Ota Benga. Could you please expand upon how the black church and the activism of the black church influenced the political climate at that time?
Yes, thank you for that question, and Nee could answer that as well. But from the second day of the exhibit, black ministers stepped up and began to protest and started galvanizing protests around the country. One of the reasons he ended up in Lynchburg is because there was a very active black congregation there that operated a seminary, and that it's a place where a lot of black leaders from around the country were trained. Adam Clayton Powell, a number of leading black activists and ministers trained at the Virginia Seminary in Lynchburg. So African American ministers, but I should note the first minister who objected to his, I should say, incarceration was a white Canadian minister, Robert Stewart MacArthur. But after him, and I think the reason why the protests even got attention was because there was a white minister who first, and he was not just a white minister, he was very prominent. He was a counsel to presidents, very, very eminent minister. But the black ministers kept Ota Benga's story before the public until he was released, and it was a black minister who also took him in Brooklyn.
Do you want to add something to that?
Oh, no.
Okay.
It's fine.
Another question? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for your remarks. As I was watching the film, I was just meditating a little bit on the sort of depiction of Ota Benga as both subhuman and superhuman, and when he began to resist, that he became the unmanageable Negro, and someone had to come and deal with him right away because this was getting out of control. And it caused me to reflect on a couple of things that I hope that you all would speak to a little bit more. Both the way that black students are being treated in school and the state-sanctioned violence on them. They're treated as both subhuman and superhuman. Their age is projected as being older and more responsible, whereas Ota Benga was portrayed as a boy and irresponsible, but also a threat. And then also the Black Lives Matter protesters. They have to be the best protesters, the most respectable protesters, the most, politically astute protesters in order to participate in the political discourse, because they're at once both very threatening and they're both portrayed as very naive. So I wondered if you all had thoughts about that.
Yeah, I just would like to make one comment, and I think that that's part of the, problematizing of this whole situation with Ota Benga, is that at this time, this is, as I say, 40 or 50 years after the enslavement, you have a situation where the leading social scientists in America and some general practitioners of religion were basically considering black people as rather docile. This has been a big part of the development, urging black people basically, now that you are free, basically don't create any problems, and there was the missionaries went down to the South, Presbyterians, Methodists, all the missionaries were really trying to get black people to be more Europeanized. In fact, Edward Smith wrote a book, The Golden Stool, in which he talked about the fact that first thing we need to do is to Christianize black folk. Europeanize black folk, and then we can Christianize them. So the complication for the life of Ota Benga is precisely that. When you are angry, it's like, oh, you can't be, they're not human. There's something's wrong with them. When in fact, it's a normal reaction to the conditions that you find yourself in.
And can I say just on the respectability politics have been in play for a long time, right? Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham coins that term in her book, Righteous Discontent, about black women in church, especially organized around the Baptist church. But it didn't come out of air. It's not like black folk are imposing these rituals of propriety, looking the right way, speaking the right way. It's because they were tripping on us if we didn't have the perfection. That's the double whammy, right? Think about it. Claudette Colvin was before Rosa Parks. But she was a 15-year-old girl. She was pregnant, right? Now, we ain't just talking about what's going to go on in the black girl. She pregnant, what's up? She got a baby, you know. Then you got white folk going, well, she's of, illicit moral character. So now, we it ain't that we internally, we got our own demons to deal with. We got to put forth the best person, because we always got to be the perfect, as you say, the perfect victim. White boy be drunk, toe up, you know what I'm saying, and messed up, but don't get demonized collectively. But our children got to be all perfect, ain't never had no weed, even though self-reporting by white people say they do more drugs than we do. It stands to reason you got more disposable income. Of course you got more weed and cocaine and heroin in your life. So, and you saw in the New York Times, was it today, yesterday, that white folk now are easing up on the drug war, because you involved, because the heroin's involved, because your drug of choice is involved.
They are, Michael, not just easing up, they are redefining it.
Yeah.
It's a sickness now.
That's right. It's an illness, and we have to be conscious of illness. You don't put ill people in jail, you put them in hospitals. A bunch of Negroes who are ill up in prison right now. So but the problem is we do internalize this. We do internalize this too. Like the Black Lives Matter kids, they cantankerous and stuff. Now that's different from legitimate criticism. Like just don't be interrupting and shit. Say something with the interruption that you're going to do. So it's not that we are incapable of saying that there is some critique to be had. It's just that why is it that the Black Lives Matter kids get subject to such vicious, acrimonious standards and insults when at the same time white, Occupy America, Occupy celebrated marginal people who are speaking up and being subversive, same thing. So the respectability of politics do play out, and we have to be conscious of them. There's another guy who was a comedian, 10 years, went around the country, damning black people, telling us to pull our pants up.
That's right.
Now there's Jell-O pudding pop problems right now. Oh, really? Really? We that's black internal. See, we can't do that. The people.
Can I just add that it's important that that his resistance be seen for what it is, right? That was an important piece of evidence for me, that he was not complicit in his own degradation, the way that for so many years the people who narrated the history indicated he was complicit, that he was there on his own volition. He fought all the time. In one letter, Werner wrote to Hornaday, the zoo director, that if you need to, drug him, give him sedatives, which is what he said he did to the frenzied people in the Congo. So we're talking about a person who was here by force and who resisted.
Yeah, that's true. We kind of edited that part out. Yeah, he said drug him. If you got to drug him, drug him. Just in reference to your question, I don't know, does anybody know of the disease dysphasia Ethiopia?
Yeah.
Dysphasia Ethiopia.
Yeah, that's when black people ran away from slavery.
Yeah.
That was a disease.
That was a disease. If a black person runs away or tries to break tools or be enslaved, there was a disease called dysphasia Ethiopia. And there was a remedy for that, which was flogging and...
And further.
Look it up.
We have a question here, but I also, it's just interesting that you indicated the part that you edited out, because that was one of the things that I was going to ask. What didn't make it that you have either had second thoughts about or that you want to see somewhere else? But let's let this gentleman who's been waiting patiently answer his question first.
I think your last comment is a great segue to my question. And that is that if there was someone walking in this room right now from another planet and they heard what we've said, their question wouldn't be, how do you deal with it? The question would be, why are they doing that to you? And I don't see much in that direction. I go to a lot of these forums. I rarely have been to a forum where the subject is, what in the hell is the matter with white people? That they have to piss on everybody who's not white.
Earlier. I think that is the question, and I think the answer is, in my earlier comments, this notion of cognitive dissonance is really serious, where people don't want to come into face anything that conflicts with the reality that they have. So my reality is that we are superior, and we've used trumped up anthropological quote unquote science, right? To justify categorization of races, right?
But we know why they did it. I'm sorry, I just have to say it. While Ota Benga was on display at the Bronx Zoo Monkey House, the Congo was being plundered of all of its natural resources. So the people who considered themselves the most civilized were the ones who were killing, maiming, and stealing all of the resources in the Congo, enslaving those people. Tens of millions of Congolese during this period were being raped, enslaved, and maimed in the name of civilizing them. So we know why it was done. It was done to justify that these people are savages, so we have to take over. We have to control Africa. We have to be the ones in control. And this is Exhibit A. We have a savage who's one step from an orangutan. If you had read an encyclopedia in 1904, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and you looked up African, they would say an African was midway between an orangutan and a human being. This was not coming from like some side, marginalized group. This was coming from Harvard University, from Columbia, from Princeton, from all of the top universities in this country. The top scientists were the ones behind what happened to Ota Benga. It was Hornaday was the founding zoologist of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., close friend to President Roosevelt. What's his name? Fairfield Osborne, the secretary of the zoo, he was the biology professor at Columbia who had gotten his PhD from Princeton, and he was very much involved in caging Ota Benga. So these were the top scientists, and at the same time, a lot of New York businessmen were doing business in the Congo. They had all kind of rubber businesses, the Guggenheim family, bunches of very wealthy whites in New York were profiting on the degradation of Ota Benga and his people.
Yeah. And can I
was making.
Yeah.
and
I'm asking.
That's it.
We say that as if, because that's true, that somehow or other mitigates against the obvious inhumanity.
Oh, no, it's not.
Characterizes all of that.
Right.
But I think
This
the point that he's getting to, if I am hearing it correctly, is one that has something to do with worldview.
Right.
His question is, what is the worldview of people who plunder?
Yeah.
Which is very different. And there are societies that exist where people can come in contact without plunder.
Right.
So the question really is, who are these people who plunder and why? And I don't want to push a little Jeffrey's theory, which is perfectly rational in some ways. But part of the question really has to do with what funds an impulse to plunder.
Shake hand to job, Dr. Sanjay.
Yes, absolutely. Now we're gonna go back. We're gonna go back here though to our edited. What got left out? We're gonna go here and then we'll go somewhere else. Yes.
Is John around?
I wanted to
Oh,
take some of that.
John stepped out. Okay. Jimmy, what got left out? We left out a lot of the letters because it was just too much. There were lots of letters which we got from the Bronx Zoological Society. A lot of the letters, a lot of the documentation that showed the trajectory of how Ota Benga got from the Bronx, from the World's Fair to the Bronx Zoo. And mostly, we got left out a lot of interviews. We actually interviewed a lot of people from the Virginia Theological Seminary, who actually, well, we put on 2 people who knew, who had connections to him. But there were several other people who were saying exact kind of the same thing. But essentially, a lot of the dehumanization aspects of like the drugging and the flogging and the kind of food he had to be fed, and you know, the filing of the teeth to make the teeth look as sharp as possible, to make him look as animalistic as possible. The New York Times, for example, a lot of the Times articles.
Can you put that stuff in the extras on the DVD?
Oh yes, I think yeah. Well, Jimmy, another strike. Well,
Where's
we
Jim?
get back.
Where's
Well,
Jim?
Jimmy's the editor's back there.
Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, well, it means we'll get back in the studio.
It's in my book, though. I'm looking forward to that work.
Let's read the book. Yeah, right. Let's read the book. Let's read the book. That's what
It's in the book.
It's a good compliment, actually. That's what I was about to say. The book is actually a very excellent compliment to the
Yeah,
film
because
as
this
well.
was really, this was real.
Oh, where's the other microphone? I can tell. One person has had the microphone that keeps passing it. We're gonna let her speak and then I'll leave it here.
I want to preface this by saying my education is in engineering and sciences. So I look at things, well, I would have majored in a pure science, but I was afraid of the humanities and social sciences because when I look at things, everybody else is over here and I end up over here. So just prefacing that. The first thing I want to say, I'm going to throw out a bunch of things and then just whatever somebody feels moved to say about them. I hear a lot of stories. Some things that have been said made me think about some things that I've come across. Like, for example, the story of Uncle Alfred at the Andrew Jackson presidential estate, where he's the only Black African who has a grave there. And, you know, he played, like, my thing with him is he knew his cards and he played his cards, right? And also the story of Betty at Andrew Jackson House, talking about lynching. An exhibit I saw at the New York Historical Society is called Without Sanctuary, those postcards of lynchings. And then the comment about what white people are saying about things, this most recent thing in South Carolina. There are comments, you know, it may not be interviewed, but like if you look on Twitter or whatever, those comments or those other views are out there. There's also this concept about excellence, like right now, this move about what can right some of these wrongs is if we're just excellent, if we just, you know, everything has to be excellent, then perhaps maybe that'll right the wrong. I don't know if I said this, but why Ota Benga? Like they said there were different cultural groups and even amongst the pygmies, there were more pygmies, so why him? How did, like, were there others? Or,
Yeah,
or,
I think,
one last
okay.
thing.
Well, that's a lot of
on
questions.
his comment, dialing it back more, this is something I haven't fully developed, but I'm working on. This concept of, in America, like what happened, or what was going on at the founding of America, number one, from the European perspective, but when the founding fathers looked at the founding of America and contemplated slavery, to me, a lot of it is about just human nature in general and economics. They had an opportunity, and they chose to go in this direction. Was that going on in Europe before? Or I like to imagine, what if they had have made a better choice? How would things be different, and what kinds of issues of human nature and the eternal struggle of man would we be dealing with if they would have made a different choice?
But that's above my pay grade. I'm going to leave that to one of these professors. But I will answer the question, why Ota Benga? Ota Benga had those beautifully chipped teeth, which was very popular in the Congo, and in fact, it was a sign of either courage. It was a conceit as innocent as like ear piercings or any kind of scarification. Yeah, so gold teeth, right? So, but it allowed Werner to depict him as a cannibal savage, which he of course was not. So I think that of the 9 Congolese who were brought to St. Louis, the reason why Ota Benga became the most popular, and he was listed in the St. Louis World's Fair brochure as a cannibal, as a savage. And Samuel Werner, when he brought him back to the United States, his plan was to bring him around as an exhibit of the only cannibal savage in the United States at this time, which he had also done, and I had an aha moment looking at your film. There's a gentleman who thinks that his father knew Ota Benga
Samuel Werner, when he was a missionary in the 1880s, because he was no longer a missionary, thank God, by the time he brought Ota Benga back, but when he was pretty much kicked out of missionary service for a number of reasons, among them having 2 illegitimate children with a Congolese woman, he brought back 2 Congolese children to the United States along with tons of artifacts from the Congo that many of them ended up at the Smithsonian. So a lot of the things you'll see at the Smithsonian from the Congo may have been collected by Samuel Phillips Werner. Anyway, among the artifacts were these 2 African children that he actually offered to the Smithsonian, that if they wanted to use them as models. So this is who we're talking about. You talk about, you know, like what kind of mind, right? What kind of inhumanity would enable someone to do that? I don't know if we can answer that, because it has to, you almost have to think that way to even get close to understanding that level of inhumanity. But I think it's why Ota Benga was pulled out and made to be the biggest victim of them all. But those 2 children never made it back to the United States. I mean, they were pretty much bounced around. They never made it back to the Congo. Yeah, they stayed here in this country.
Yeah, if I could just add one little comment, because this is it's a profound question, of course. I think, and I don't believe that education can solve all problems, but I think that part of what we were witnessing at that moment, and what we witness periodically and almost all times, is ignorance. I think that there was a tremendous ignorance on the part of the white population in Europe and the United States about Africa. And not just about Africa, probably about the whole world. I mean, and I'm not going to say anything about the slate of politicians we have running now, in terms of, you know, people who could be possibly in charge of institutions. But when you think of the early part of the 20th century, that these people were in charge of making decisions, and they had no understanding that, number one, there are many, I rarely use the word pygmy, because I always think of the ethnic groups of the people. They were either, you know, Twa or Mbuchi or different ethnic names, and you call them by their ethnic names. Right. But at any rate, Ota Benga is living in a part of the world where one of the oldest mathematical calculators in the world is found. Come on. The Ishango bone. So it's a few hundred miles from where he's taken. You have this 28,000-year-old calculator, mathematical calculator, the second oldest in the world, is found in the Congo. So obviously the white people didn't know that at that time. Now, the question is, if they had known it, would it have made any difference? You know, of course, that's another level. And that's above my pay grade. I think that is Michael.
Also, don't you know, when I'm teaching African American literature and we're examining slave narratives, the students are always amazed at these atrocities that are taking place. And the narratives are constantly asserting humanity, just like the exhibits that you've been looking at here, against a project of inhumanity that can justify the actions, the inhumane actions, because if these people are inhumane, if they are equivalent to animals, then therefore we're doing nothing wrong, right? And so I think that's the first component. But then the other thing is that there are people who are going into these regions of Africa and interacting with high culture. So if you look at a work like, you know, the Olata Aquino's narrative, he very smoothly, his rhetorical skills are wonderful, where he asserts, here's our culture, here's what we do, I interact with these Europeans, I think that they're, I don't know what they are, ghosts, devils, blah, 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 blah. I meet them, I encounter Christianity, I think that's Christianity, then oh, I've learned that this really isn't Christianity. He ends the piece with this really complicated, like, well, now I'm really Christian because I've encountered this. These people aren't that, so I've taken it upon myself to really become what a real Christian is, right? Like, I've never met one. So, so there are people who are going into these spaces and they're seeing the technology, the culture, the implementations that certainly will go against all that.
Exactly.
That's laid out on the other side.
Exactly.
So again,
so that's where the confusion comes
yeah, the confusion.
because you can say ignorance, but a lot of it wasn't ignorance.
Right.
Because if you go right now, the Metropolitan Museum has a exhibit called Congo, and it has all of these beautiful artworks from many of these villages, and no one who sees those artworks can say these were made by savages.
That's right.
They've never seen a baboon make that.
That's right.
They've never seen a primate make that. So they had to know that they were dealing with advanced civilizations, and they did it anyway. And I think it's just greed.
Well, I think just to add to all of that brilliance, look, remember Saul Bellow said that when the pygmies produce a Dostoevsky, then we can take multiculturalism seriously, that kind of thing.
I remember that.
And we got Toni Morrison sitting on these shores, right? So your point about dehumanizing us to the point where you deny the obvious literacies we possess. Homer could neither read nor write. Ain't nobody gonna call him illiterate.
That's right.
Right? So it depends upon where you stand. So I don't want to exceptionalize white folk like they're a strain or a genus of humanity that is so outside the pale, I guess pun intended, that they are somehow unimaginably more evil than anybody else, because people in similar positions do similar evil things. But having said that, the historical record shows where time and again, it wasn't the exception of white civilization, it was the extension of white civilization. That, in other words, it wasn't just like the meanest people did this. This is the heart of the culture itself, giving forth white supremacy, giving forth the notion and the belief. And what I mean by white supremacy is the conscious or unconscious belief that other people are inferior or some are superior for no other reason than their inherent identity. And that inherent identity is shaped by a slavish dependence on, a superiority that exists only in the minds of those who assert it. So for me, when we think about why white folk did this, I teach at the well-known African-American school called Georgetown. And often in my classes, I say to my white students, because I got a lot of them, and I got a lot of students of color, I say, now imagine what it means to be in a world that black people live in, or people of color, or women live in, where we always have to give, and this is relating to what Professor Asante said, we always have to give reasons for why. Something bad happened, why did your black people do this? And we have to stand up and represent. I would love for some white people who are present here today to just bravely, we love you, we are too, just bravely say to us what your thoughts are about whiteness. And we know whiteness is broad. People could be from Poland, Lithuania, it's Italy, and so on. But whiteness is made in the crucible of America into something different. I would love for any white person here to say, I've been thinking about this and looking at this film and listening to this conversation. This is why I think what happens in white culture is X, Y, and Z. I would love for any, I don't know if we have any white brothers and sisters here, that would just be willing to say what they think about what this is, this phenomenon of white supremacy, the impulse for dominance, and the dehumanization of people of color, in this case, especially Africa, for the purposes of reasserting a kind of superior value. I just want to throw that out there. I don't know if we got white folk in the audience or not, and if so, if they would want to speak. Now, that's what it means to be black.
John.
Yeah, I love to speak about that.
All right, Joe.
That's the reason why I made the movie with Lee Cocker. Right. So I can already express myself.
Right. I meant other people who make the film. White folks who were not involved in the making. Don't make me start pointing out. I got
Point of reference. I don't know that I've ever seen this happen.
Thank you so much.
Got to drop mic.
Okay, to take the professor's question.
Thank you.
As if I have a uniform, nice
That's
and
all right.
tidy answer, but I have some of the same questions myself. And the only possible way that I can understand the story of Ota Benga and all of the other related questions that have been brought here today is through my professional experience working as a mental health professional with perpetrators and victims of domestic violence. Okay? And I've done a good amount of work with both factions, victims and abusers, and I don't have a good understanding of how that works. But when we talk about issues of slavery and genocide, the same experiences I've had professionally come to mind, which is where you have a sense of entitlement that is so psychologically deep, it justifies the absolute destruction and relies on the absolute destruction of other for your sense of thriving. Okay, and so the kind of cognitive dissonance that the other professor mentioned is par for the course. And in family systems that have this kind of arrangement, it's impossible to mention the fact that the person who's destroying the quality of life of the other family members, it's impossible to mention that. It's like it doesn't even exist. Because it's too scary.
Right.
It's too dangerous. It's too threatening. And I think you can see the parallel in the history of this country, where you can't say that black people are being killed by white forces of power in some communities because it's too dangerous to say. You could get killed for saying that. You see what I mean? And so it becomes unconscious and it becomes fragmented and off the radar. And I don't know why that the European cultures and people who look like me do this. I don't know why. But of course we're not the only people who do this, but we have a pretty bad record of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But also, there's one more point I want to say. I make a distinction between, like it's implied in the conversation, between people who are ignorant and people who are not.
Right.
And there's this parallel of people who are in power who are not ignorant, who are bringing Ota Benga to the United States.
That's right.
They know what they're doing.
That's right.
They know what they're doing. And a lot of bad things happen out of ignorance in other parts of the community, but there's a difference to that matter.
And I just want, first of all, yeah, right. I think we should applaud him, and that's really, really, really good. And I appreciate you very much for that, because those are the kinds of comments we need to hear more often. You know, because what we do, well, at least what I do in my own writings and my own works, is that I try to figure out from what white people say in their writings why this happens. In 1935, Edmund Husserl, in his Vienna lecture, gave a lecture in which this was 2 years after the establishment of the Nazis came to power in Germany. Husserl gave a lecture in which he said that it is the innate quality of Europeans to be basically masters of the world. And that only when we have allowed other people to challenge this have we had problems. That everybody in the world seeks to be Europeanized. We, on the other hand, and he uses as an example the Indians, we will never, in our good mind, seek to be Indianized. In other words, the Indians want to be like us. But we will never, because if we understand our role, there is no reason for us to ever want to be like anybody else. So because in an interesting sense, there's some people who know this and have this idea of the European project, and then there are other people who are basically ignorant of it, but the results is the same ultimately. You see, I don't think the policeman on in the classroom cares anything about this notion of the European project, but as the young man said, it is so deeply ingrained in the European culture that it comes out the same way anyway.
That's right. It's a reflex.
It's a reflex.
And that's, you said much more eloquently what I was trying to say. It's a reflex, a collective reflex of a culture. That's why I mean it's not exceptional.
Yeah.
It's part of the
Yeah.
business of being alive and not being able to say that because you can't. Can you be a black person and watch one of your young ladies, a woman who we found out later is in foster care. The phone is her lifeline. So ask her why.
That's right.
She is so invested in that machinery, not because she's trying to, FaceTime or Vimeo or Snapchat.
That's right.
This is her lifeline and connection in a way in which she's been deracinated. So now the cop is brought in to treat her in a way that he would think twice or three times
This is a white.
about dealing as a white person. Because the article in the New York Times that talked about heroin, and white folks said that folk think twice because they got money. They have they can call up the person who runs the stuff, the police chief, the prosecutor. They know the mayor, and so as a result of that, can you imagine what it means for us to see our children shot down in the street like dogs? And the reason it's not enough, it is important for Black Lives Matter and for other black activists and other activists of color. Martin Luther King Jr. said, I'm not Russian, but if something happened in Russia that was wrong, I'd have to speak up. So I want to see white brothers and sisters step up and say, this is not the burden of black people. Because Du Bois said, what does it feel like to be a problem? We have been problematized. The question is, what does this reflect about pockets of pathology in the dominant culture that need to be addressed from within the arc and the logic and the moral purview of the white brothers and sisters whose cops they are relatives to, whose kin do this kind of thing, even if not immediately. That's the kind of moral responsibility I think we need to ask of our white brothers and sisters in the broader society to help us fight this plague, however we name it. We ain't trying to essentialize white brothers and sisters, but we trying to say in the historical arena in which we operate, whiteness has had a certain kind of representation that needs to be challenged, and I think that's the power of us coming together, at least to talk about it in those terms.
We're going to take the next comments in sequence, and then we will ask each panelist to make closing remarks that try to respond to your comments. So if you would make your question or your comment now and pass the microphone to the next person with a hand raised, we'll take them all at once and have closing remarks with responses.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful film. My name's Judy, and I've worked with Central African hunter-gatherers, or pygmies, as they call them, for over 20 years. And, one of the things that I find curious is how people bring their own passions and their own injustices and project those onto the pygmy experience. And Ota Benga is a very interesting example of that. How he has come to represent injustices in America. But one of the things that people forget is that these injustices are going on every single day in Africa. There is a hierarchy in Africa, and it's about indigenous versus, a dominant hierarchy. And, I was in Rwanda in 1993-94, and that was my first real, experience of human rights abuses towards pygmies. They were hunted. They were hunted like animals, and they were dehumanized literally in the way that they were killed. They were called pygmies, which equals dog. And, I can't help but, think that this is, of course, resonates with all of us and these injustices that go on in America. That said, it is a human condition. And, rather than Homo sapiens, I think it's Homo colonizensis or something, because it seems to be that this is what we do as oppressors. And I'm really curious to know how we can use the painful example of Ota Benga to learn from these lessons, to make differences. One of the things that I think is a cage that continues is labels. Which label do we fit into? Depends where you go. My mum's from southern India, my father's English. In England, I am not white. I go to Africa, guess what? I am white. So it's like, can't we just give it a break? Can't we just be human? And how do we do that?
Hi, my name is Nubia Jennerson. I'm a sophomore from Howard University, and as a first year here, I have been honored to walk into Millionaire March, and it's just very interesting to come from home, and I have white family, and they ask me about my experience here, and they tell me, when I walked to the march, they said, why are you walking? You have everything, like everything's been given. What else are you walking for? And and it's that ignorance, and it was very innocent because they're not malicious. It was just, they were just very keen. They just wanted to know. And every day I tell them everything that I do at school. And it is an eye-opening experience. And I want this film to be presented at Howard because I think everyone needs to be aware of this topic because it, as a psychology major and a human development minor, like it has sparked something within me because I want to know like the psychological impact not only it had on him, but what did the people who were bringing him over, what were they thinking as well, So I feel like as a person of my age, and people older too, they are, you can't say we have to educate white people before we educate ourselves. So that's all I can say. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I have two questions. The first is a lot of times we Black people are marginalized or, abused, like, oh, get over it already. It was how many years ago? One common thing I hear is the Jews went through something, they say worse, because it was 6 million Jews killed at a certain time, but they're getting over it. Obviously, that's a very ignorant comment, but I wanted to have someone, what actually sparked that comment was when I heard that Adolf Hitler liked what Darwin was saying, and he basically thought the Jews were of a lesser class or whatever the issue was. What do you think about when people compare what happened during the Holocaust to what happened before pre-civil rights and things like that? Number two is there's this discourse going on nowadays between Africans and African Americans where, they're being compared by Africans and saying, people are saying, oh, the Africans are much better than the African Americans. They're much more focused, much more hardworking. And then it's creating this subtle war between Africans of the diaspora and Africans here living in America. And basically, because we have, my opinion is that we have a totally different mindset in the diaspora compared to here. People in diaspora were not enslaved. They don't have that history that our African American sisters and brothers have here. So I wanted to kind of hear your comments on that, if you will. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the making of this film. I found myself fighting back tears during the entire time, and it reminded me of when President Obama first ran for office. I cried for at least 40 minutes on film. My daughter was taping me. It was these emotions that I didn't know I had in me. So this film did the same thing. It brought back a lot of feelings, like what is going on. One thing I wanted to add, in particular, Dr. Dyson, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's theory, I wanted to know, what do you think of her theory? And I know this is probably opening Pandora's box, but what do you think about her theory and how it is connected to this film? Thank you.
Thank you.
Why does it appear, at least to me, that whenever we get into these dialogues, at some point it tends to deteriorate between ourselves, shades of ourselves being opposed to other shades of ourselves? We seem to lose track of where the enemy is.
Yeah. My name is Desiree Van Frederick. I am a descendant of enslaved Africans in South Carolina and Jamaica who went back to Freetown, Sierra Leone. I immigrated here when I was 7 years old and was supposedly had legal status until I was 24 and I became undocumented. And more recently, in 2013, I was detained by USCIS. And as I watched this film and learned the story of Ota Benga, and I've known of the story as I've researched in the past, but to watch this film and sit in here knowing my own personal experience with immigration and being an African in this country, I just saw so many parallels, and I don't know if this is something, and I'll post this to you as the filmmaker, is this an angle that you tried to explore in the past, or do you see the connection, and is there value to you in having that dialogue presented in present day as immigration
hot button topics, as we all know.
Okay, hello, my name is Sandy Waters. I am a graduate student at Howard studying film, so it's very interesting to me because I love documentaries. Basically, I have a couple comments, not really a question, but because of the time, like a couple weeks ago was Columbus Day, and during that time, you know, you see a lot of stuff on Facebook about when Columbus came over here and landed over here, not discovered America, but the crew that he brought with him and the genocide that followed, you know, I think about that. And then the other day was Halloween, and you see a lot of people doing the appropriation, and they want to be blackface to, you know, put a costume on, but, you know. So I just want to bring those couple of items up.
Hi, my name is Trey Lipscomb. I'm a graduate student at Temple University. My question is either on record or by opinion for each one of you. Why did not the ministers seek to return Benga back to Africa and sought instead to, you know, to educate them?
I'll just do a quick little reminder. What can we learn from Ota Benga? What can we learn, or what needs to happen in terms of discourse between Africans and African Americans? Someone to speak on Francis Scott Welsing's theory, why the deterioration of conversations moving away from the primary topic, immigration and the contemporary moment that can be likened to Ota Benga, and then why didn't ministers return to Ota Benga or seek to return Ota Benga to Africa rather than to attempt to educate him? Who wants to start?
Yeah, well, the last question, why didn't the ministers return him back to Africa? It's complex, and from what I've garnered so far, and the whole thing is, first of all, I think, well, it wasn't as easy as putting someone on a plane and sending them back. It was by boat back then. And they were not just, I don't think they were just going to put him on a boat and send him straight back on a boat to, you know, the Congo. He had to change boats here in Liverpool and all, you know. I think that's the first complication, and probably money was the second. But the third part is this. The ministers felt they were beholden to keep him at a place of refuge, a sacred place of refuge where they themselves felt, you know, he would be safe. And so they sent him to, you know, the theological seminary. And again, back then, we got to kind of think about what the mindset was educating folks in the Christian concept, like, you know, Dr. Dyson has said, becoming good Christians.
But also the idea was to train him to be a missionary to go back and help his people. That same seminary is where Chilembe, am I pronouncing his name correctly? Chilembe was trained as a missionary, and he did go back and became a really radical leader in his own country. But I think it was, you're right, it was money. And also Samuel Werner offered to take him back, and Ota Benga said no. He did not want to go back into that man's hands.
And please, y'all, be patient with me, because I'm probably the only one in here, sitting up here, maybe probably this. I'm not into religion, into Christian religion at all. So I'm not into Muslim religion or any religion. So it's just, so I just want to say, and I always have to do this. And when there are black people in the audience, I always feel real nervous. But let me just tell you.
In the name of Jesus.
My problem is this. My problem is that the ministers had a problem themselves.
There you go.
And that within the African American community, there were some people probably who felt like the white people. That Ota Benga was a representative from maybe a less civilized place. And so for them, the Christianizing of him was to build him up and bring him to a civilized position. That's what I feel, and I feel that, and for me, of course, that's wrong. But that was my feeling, and I think I want to tie this on to that question of African Americans and Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent. I think that this is from the same source. That the same source is white racial domination. whether you're in the diaspora or whether you're in the continent. And I think you can't make any distinctions like, well, they were enslaved, but we were not. Because colonization had just as much impact in many areas. I lived in Africa, and so I know that what happened with the people in Africa itself, you had an incredible mental destruction. I mean, the mental dislocation caused by colonization. I mean, when you would beat children because they don't speak English and they don't speak Arabic, and you beat them because they're trying to speak their own language, then you're also creating mental problems. So my thing is this, that the relationship between Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora can only get better when we know more about each other's conditions and situations. That's all. 3 minutes.
Speedy, your closing comments?
Oh, my
Closing comments.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
You want me to go?
No, and I'll just take a second. I just want to, as I'm listening to your comments here, I think that these civilizing narratives permeate every pore of our contemporary culture. And again, because I've been assigned the popular culture, sports component within this dialogue, I'm going to go there. And so as you are listening to the commentary, the way in which the presentation of your contemporary athletes who are supposed to be this sort of normalizing agents, there's this constant back and forth. So really, I think we really have to be aware of how the very way in which Ota Benga is situated as other, it continues. And the narratives of, oh, he grew up in whatever scenario and you're getting an opportunity. You continuously hear those kind of narratives. If you have conversations, I'm constantly on this parade around contemporary college athletics and slavery. And people say, well, you're getting an opportunity they would have never had. So I think we have to be aware of how these sort of coded civilizing narratives, because we're talking about the big money sports are those predominated by those young men of color, right? And so we just have to be aware of how that particular narrative predominates every pore, whether it's music, hip hop, and other or sport culture.
Yeah. I'm gonna just run through these questions like lickety split. Just
you gotta answer the question, the Francis Cresswell's question, brother. I'm waiting for that.
I said I'm gonna go through it. So just be human, give it a break. The first one, right? True enough, but all oppressions ain't created equal.
That's right.
Right?
That's
so as you well know, I mean, you're speaking of your existence with the hunters and gatherers and seeing the viciousness. We often, some white people say, why don't you black people just get over this? And I go like, I be trying to get over it, but people keep reminding me. Shit. I'm up in Arizona, I'm trying to chill, and somebody treat me like a nigga. I'm like, dude, stop. I'm trying to transcend. And then the cab driver won't stop for me. Go Uber. So for me, trying to tell people it's a figment of your imagination, it's a projection of your collective unconscious. Race is not real except when it matters. Right? It ain't real, but it has material weight. So just, the humanity of it, I think all of us should embrace our humanity. But until that time, I don't want to get over being black. I want you to get over what you think about my blackness.
That's right.
I don't want to stop being black. I just want you to stop thinking what you think about my blackness. And I think that's very important. So I'm in agreement with the humanity part. See the humanity in all of us. Black folk can go to a white film and start crying or laughing. Ain't no Negroes up there. Oh my God, we identify. Our black films, which are universal as well, white folk, well, it's a black film, but it's got human values that you need to hear about. So that's the kind of switch we need to talk about. Number two, the the ignorance about, in terms of the psychological impact and the ignorance that I think our college student was talking about, absolutely right. And I think that that kind of ignorance, as we've already said, some of it is ignorance and some of it is deliberate ignorance, right? The Catholic Church has a notion called ignorance that is almost culpable ignorance. That's it. When the policeman stops you, bad analogy. When the policeman stops you and says you were going 40 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, you go, I didn't know that. Well, when you got the license, you're supposed to study the book that tells you that rectangle, whatever that is, shows you what it is. It's culpable ignorance. So we can't keep claiming ignorance about stuff you're supposed to know better than. We can't keep re-educating because you know the deal. So I think we have to take that into account. In terms of getting over it already, in terms of the Holocaust versus slavery, come on. I mean, they're both messed up. Ain't no, Barbara Christian, the late critical cultural theorist and English professor, talked about the oppression derby. My oppression is worse than yours. Look, part of what, in one sense I envy Jewish brothers and sisters because their stuff happened in the 20th century. You got pictures, right? We ain't got no pictures. That's part of the problem. I wish it happened during Twitter. I wish we could have tweeted out the stuff that was going on. Vimeo, Snapchat this, on the auction block. No more auction block. We have Paul Robeson, but that ain't the same, right? So part of it is the visual and the technological mediated a consciousness about 6 million brothers and sisters who were maliciously and evilly put under. And then you can't measure no 100 million folk on the Ma'afa, on the Middle Passage that were lost. It ain't which one was worse. They're both evil and unimaginably horrible, and we should acknowledge that. And then Africans versus African Americans. I got a book coming out on Obama. Professor Newkirk has her book out right now that I just bought. So the thing is, and I want you all to buy that book because it's a great book, but I got a book coming out in February where I talk about some of these issues. It's about Obama, called The Black Presidency. And I talk about this because partly, again, why Obama was attractive is because he was a foreign kind of blackness as opposed to the indigenous run-of-the-mill blackness right here. And we have to acknowledge that. Even though we know Africans and African Americans, you see our beautiful sister talked about the fact that as an African immigrant, it's a paradoxical thing. On the one hand, Africans are not even spoken about under the immigration crisis.
That's right.
Right? Because we're not talking about the way in which Haitians are being demonized and Africans are being demonized. But on the other hand, anything but an American Negro, not from Detroit, but from Dakar. So that's part of the problem we had to deal with. And half the people coming to our institutions of higher education in predominantly white schools are from Africa or from the Caribbean. So it's not that we got to demonize them. Why can't we pay attention to the indigenous ways in which black people have to get on? Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. I saw her when I was a young man on Phil Donahue. Changed my, she spoke for me. It was powerful, it was brilliant. I have subsequently developed some differences of opinion about what she might say, but I respect her genius, her brilliance, her insistence that we deal with white supremacy and the kind of envy that whiteness might possess toward a blackness, and the fear that it might be erased is something that you ain't got to just reduce to scientific stuff. You can see that going on in the culture as well.
All right.
And then shades of self, I try to talk about that, light versus dark. I mean, that's our ignorance. The paper bag test in New Orleans, you get in this, if you were darker than that paper bag, you couldn't get in. We still doing that to each other today. If Barack Obama was dark skinned, would he be president right now? Just think about that. Ben Carson's running. Wow. You know what? Let me say this about Ben Carson. A genius as a physician, but he separated twins. You need to separate yourself from that bull stuff that's going on right now in terms of ideology. In terms of Columbus, look, at Halloween, Columbus and how we know what Columbus is about. We know, look, I go to a Catholic school, we get Columbus Day off, so I'm going to represent for that for a minute. I love that day off. Hell yeah, let's take that off and let's celebrate it. But let's educate ourselves about what that meant. Conquest is not simply about Columbus. We do the same thing in our own culture. We do the same thing in America. We do the same thing in the West. So vanquishing the other is something that we should be familiar with, not simply with Columbus, but across the board. It is much more complicated than that. And then finally, it seems to me that what I take away from this in terms of Ota Benga is that we have to insist upon the fundamental humanity and dignity of all people. See, and so for me, that's why I'll end the way I started. When I go to black churches and I'm a black preacher, and I feel the same way you do, though, Doc. Many a day. I'm ashamed, right? But many a day I'm saying, like, why are we going to turn around and do the same thing on the people that's been done to us? So we have to apologize to white supremacists because we're heterosexists. We are sexualists. We are supremacists in terms of our own sexual order. Now, that ain't the same. The black people go, well, that ain't the same. You know, they can change their sexuality. I can't change my color. Well, slow down with that. Because we ain't got no science on how people become. They can't no more get up and be gay tomorrow than you can get up and be straight if you're gay. Or they can't no more get up and be straight if you're gay. And if you can, I've helped you out and given you some insight about your own sexuality and how fluid it is. The bottom line is, whether it's sexuality, whether it's poor black people, and the reason I brought up that comedian who demonized people for 10 years, before he was accused, allegedly, of white women and drugging, he was demonizing black women with no accountability for the same black bourgeoisie that would demonize a rapper or an R&B singer. That's the kind of viciousness we have to pay attention to on our own culture as well. And at the end of the day, either, look, it's not all lives matter versus black lives. We know what that is about. But within black culture, either all black lives matter or no black lives matter at all. And that's the beauty of what we see with Ota Benga.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel. And we would be remiss also if we did not say a huge thank you to Melissa Kitchener and the staff of the Smithsonian for putting the program together.